The Virtual Curbside is a production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Utah AAP, working together to improve children's lives through education, advocacy, and networking. Hi, this is Paul Wirkus from the Utah AAP. Welcome to this week's edition of the Virtual Curbside, where we bring pediatric providers together with subspecialists to get smarter about all things pediatric and better acquainted as a community of caregivers. The Virtual Curbside is brought to you in part by a generous grant from Primary Children's Hospital. Primary Children's Hospital, the child first and always. Welcome back to the Virtual Curbside. It's always my pleasure when we have a fifth week in the month and I get to talk to my friend Angelo Giardino about books. And so welcome back to the podcast, Angelo.
Thanks, Paul. I'm looking forward to talking about a leadership book today.
Yeah, that's exciting. This is a book that you recommended, and I really thought it was very thoughtful. There's so much to think about. I guess that's the definition of thoughtful, isn't it? There was a lot to think about in this book. This month is Humbitious by Amer Kaissi. Humbitious being a portmanteau word of humble and ambitious, and so that's what we're going to be talking about. What attracted you to this book first?
So I think where this came from is I was at a meeting of a number of chief medical officers, and everybody kind of shared a book that was impactful to them. And one of the colleagues I really respect had suggested this book. Of course, I wrote it down and I got it. And as I started to read it, it really struck me as so consistent with how pediatricians approach leadership, which is, you need to be self-aware and you need to try to do something good for people. And it's not all about you. And if you think about pediatrics and our work with families, I think it just really resonated with me that a pediatrician in general approaches their leadership with a sense of stewardship and humility.
It seems sort of obvious what the issues are, but I think he spends a fair amount of time explaining both what humility is and what ambition is. You want to go into that at all?
Sure, that'd be really great. I think he really did want to talk about humility as being self-aware, being open to people's feedback, and not being focused totally on yourself. I mean, that's what I took from it. I don't know if you have a more formal definition.
No, I don't think so. And it's interesting because early in the book, he divides into quadrants, describes then the advantage of having both high ambition and high humility, that somebody with a lot of ambition and not much humility ends up being arrogant and the obnoxious sort of achiever without thinking about other people. With low humility and low ambition are just passive and don't do anything. And then somebody with a lot of humility but no ambition ends up being a self-effacing underachiever. So what he's looking for is that sweet spot of the sort of self-awareness that I think you were just describing, along with, I guess, self-awareness that makes you both ambitious to do things as well as having insight both into yourself and how you relate to the world.
And he does spend a little bit of time, Paul, being really clear. Being humble is a little bit more than being modest. And it's not weakness. It's really consistent, frankly, as I was reading it, with our view in terms of patient safety and being highly reliable. There are other people in the room that might know something. And if you're a really great leader, you're very interested in creating the environment where you can elicit the expertise of the person you're talking to so that you can, as a leader, make a better decision. So I think, frankly, a humble leader has a lot of ego strength because they can accept the fact that they don't know all the facts. They don't know all the information, and they're going to make a better decision for their organization if they're willing to listen to what's on the minds of the people they're working with. So to me, humility, we tend to see it sometimes as being like quiet or modest or weak, but it's actually having a fair amount of strength because you can keep your mouth shut and learn a little bit before you commit to a course of action.
So putting this then into the experience that you were describing before, I think you suggested that pediatricians aim for this combination of ambition and humility. Do you think that's generally true of medicine?
Well,
Or is that how people end up doing pediatrics?
yeah, I'd like to believe that, but I have worked with a few subspecialties in medicine and surgery where I'm not sure they're heavy on the humility side. So I think there is something unique to pediatricians who truly want to empower the family to partner with them and do a good job for their kid. And I know I'm biased on this, but over the years, having worked with a number of folks that become medical directors and chief medical officers and academic leaders, there is something in the ethos of pediatrics where you're willing to be disciplined and listen a little before you take a position. And I do think that's somewhat unique to pediatrics, frankly.
Because I think there are several areas where it comes up. Obviously, the implication of dealing with families, of talking to parents, and quite frankly, talking to patients who are kids who aren't going to necessarily be super diplomatic I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
kids are willing to take you down a notch if they feel like it. But not only there, but ideally, I think that we have that same sort of attitude and practice with the other caregivers we work with,
Yes.
nurses and therapists and medical assistants and social workers and all those people who I think if we're smart, we understand we rely on completely to make this happen.
This whole notion of multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary care, I do think pediatrics is really kind of at the vanguard of that. So, he is a professor at, I think, Trinity University in San Antonio. So he does bring in a lot of literature. So then he goes beyond his conceptual work, and he's a business professor, right? So he brings in a lot of literature that over and over again suggests how much more effective, how much more productive teams and organizations are that have what would be characterized as a humble leader at the helm rather than someone who, as you were saying in that 2x2 table, would be arrogant. And I thought that was a really valuable part of the book as well, because I always like to have that empiric side to this conceptual work. And, we've done some other books where the authors do bring in a fair amount of literature. So if you're interested in the concept, but also then having the backup academic work. He does a good job at weaving that in, but in an interesting way. And it's a nice way to read the story.
I should give a shout out, by the way. One of the people he cites extensively in the first section of the book is Brad Owens, who's a professor at Brigham Young, who has
Uh-huh.
done a lot of research in this area.
And he also gives a great shout out to Ben Franklin.
Yes.
And since I'm from Philadelphia, whenever you use Ben Franklin, I'm kind of in your camp. So it turns out that Ben Franklin was kind of like a leadership theorist, and he wanted to develop his virtues. And he had this list. And then when his colleagues looked at his list, they said, Ben, you should have humility on there as well. And then he started doing that.
Because he was going to do all of these things. He was going to
Yes.
work on each one of them sequentially. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and he was a little bit arrogant about it. So they tried to take him down a peg or two.
And I would have to say that then it is a mark of true humility when you can say, oh, maybe that is something I should work on.
Yes, exactly. And this open-mindedness is truly kind of in the point in history that we are right now. Being a moderate and being willing to listen to people who are going to be impacted by the decisions you make, I think that's actually wise and strong and is a sign of someone who's capable. So I particularly like that kept getting woven into the story that humility is not about being weak or indecisive. It's about being willing to elicit the information that the people around you have to share so that you make better decisions. And I don't know, it just kind of felt like it was noble. And I really enjoyed that.
Noble, and frankly, there's some potential for self-interest in this because not listening is a great way to miss out on something that might save your life.
Exactly. And that's where the patient safety tie-in comes in. All of us have been in situations where we're so grateful that someone spoke up. And as we were kind of plowing ahead and maybe going to do something that was going to harm someone, we had a colleague or a member of the team raise a concern or ask a question. And that's the wisdom of this. And the other thing, he spends a fair amount of time talking about how you create the culture where ambitious leaders do well. And it has a lot to do with expressing gratitude. He spent a lot of time talking about how a really great ambitious leader is really smart about making sure that people hear thank you and appreciation and feel recognized on a regular basis.
Yeah, I thought it was great. He talked about this person who made it his mission to write thank you notes to people,
Yes.
and handwritten thank you notes. And I can't remember what the occasion was, whether it was a retirement or something. He was going through something, and people brought out these hundreds of thank you notes that he'd written, and it makes an impact. And it's not a performative gesture. I think it's for a leader, it's almost like a mindfulness activity that I'm recognizing my place in this and that I'm giving back by recognizing what everyone else does.
Yeah, to me, as I was reading it, it was almost like adding a leavening agent. I like to cook. So adding yeast or baking powder to something, it really is adding this, it's part of the recipe, adding the leavening agent. And it helps create that culture. And that person you were talking about, I think when they retired, people made a video for them. And I think his comment was, "What's your video going to look like?"
Yeah, yeah.
So it really was a call to action. The other thing I thought was really interesting, he's a business professor, so he uses examples from companies. But if you've ever had a Kind bar, I've always thought it was interesting that it was called Kind. But that company is focused on being kind and considerate.
Right.
And they came up with something. I guess if you work for the Kind bar company, if you see somebody doing something really nice, like in your day, you give them a little bit of a card, and then there's a QR code, and then you can fill something out and they'll mail you a Kind bar. So if you're on a subway and somebody's doing something, courteous and respectful, you give them this little card. And it's so true to the Kind culture. You just got the sense of just how that's like a flywheel. And, you do that and you put some good stuff in the world, good stuff goes around and good stuff happens.
And if I remember right, you not only get the Kind bar, but you also get another card with a QR code that you can pass along to the next
Yes.
person that you
Yeah.
see
Yeah. Yeah, you pay
doing
forward.
the kind thing.
Yeah.
One of the things that he does talk about, and because this is something I think is important to acknowledge, is that false modesty is not the same thing as humility.
Yeah, people see through that. So, like on your 2 by 2 table, if you're being manipulated.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you do have to kind of get a little zen here and figure out like what, you're gonna, like Ben Franklin, you're gonna have to pursue this virtue.
Just for people who are thinking about reading this, it's divided into sections, and I wanted to name the sections. So it starts with an overview of humility and ambition in leadership, and then moves on to three major sections: humble leadership in relation to self, others, and the universe. And I thought it was very fascinating, especially because those last two sections, the topics within the humble leadership in relation to others were open mindedness, appreciation, and generosity. We were just talking about that. But then I thought that the very last section was so thoughtful about humble leadership in relation to the universe, where he talks about transcendence and that everyone needs to spend time thinking about where they exist in relation to the universe, what the meaning of all this is, and what can I change and what can I not change. And I thought it was so thoughtful.
Yeah, what I'm really enjoying is we've done this curbside podcast for so long, Paul. A lot of the books are now overlapping. So, that transcendence piece really resonated with me. And if you remember when we read The Anxious Generation,
Yes.
one of the things that Jonathan Haidt talked about, one of the things that kind of helps you deal with kind of anxiety and all the tumult in the world is if you accept the fact that there are things bigger than you, whether that's the awesomeness of nature or your spirituality. And, a lot of the authors that really reflect on this do really encourage us to tap into that transcendence piece.
Yeah.
So it's kind of cool. And I think it might have been the self-directed child book also talked about like meditation and transcendental meditation and how there is really something to being reflective and understanding your place in the world. And I think ambitious leaders need to know that as well. But I love how some of the books we've read over the past couple years are really kind of honing in on some of these kind of overarching truths and the wisdom when you really reflect on how to kind of be a satisfied, content, positive, constructive individual.
Absolutely. And I do think that a thoughtful pediatrician, I think a pediatric practitioner who has the great experience of being able to spend time with families, watching kids grow up, I think that if you can't stand back and just be overwhelmed by the wonder of that, you're really missing out.
Yeah. Yeah. Part of Humbitious is ambitious. And so these are really high performing people. Like these leaders are achieving great things. They're building solid teams. They're encouraging good work. They're working on important missions. So it's really this kind of coalescence of kind of an open, positive style with really high performance as a goal. But you're interested in bringing the team along with you, not chewing them up so that you can get somewhere yourself.
Yeah. So you would recommend being Humbitious?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I personally love working with ambitious leaders. I've worked with the whole gamut, and you have a lot more satisfaction working with a ambitious leader. You feel like you're part of something that you're really proud of.
It really seems like it increases the likelihood that everyone can learn from everyone and go to the next level because you're working together.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's so affirming. And, obviously, a lot of us serve in a mentoring role as well. If you're a mentor and you see your mentee or your protege really essentially eclipse you at some point because you've really encouraged them and helped clear the path, and then they become really knowledgeable or skillful or capable, there's just a sense of contentment and pride that the person that you invested some time in really has built on that and now has exceeded what you knew.
Yeah. And in some ways, I think that goes back to that notion of transcendence that he talks about, that recognizing that very few of us are going to be remembered in a few generations like Ben Franklin.
Right.
But what we can hope to do is leave positive fingerprints by encouraging and nurturing other people.
Yeah, I agree. I have a feeling our audience would really like this book, and it is actually a leadership skill, and there's a level of discipline. So, if people are thinking about their leadership toolbox, I would definitely get my hands around this notion of being a ambitious leader.
Thanks for recommending it. Shout out, by the way, Jonathan Haidt has a new book directed to kids called The Amazing Generation, Your Guide to Fun and Freedom in a Screen-Filled World. And it's directed to kids to give them a notion of things that they can do to enjoy the world more.
Oh, great. We might need to put that on our podcast then, because it would be good if, obviously we're from a little bit of a different generation. So it
Yeah.
might be good for us to know how to talk to the kids nowadays.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, Angelo. I always look forward to these conversations and look forward to being able to talk to you again in a couple of months.
Thanks. And that's probably because you're ambitious.
I'm working on it.
Yeah, good, good.
Trying to be a work in progress.
Yeah, good. Take
All
care.
right. Well, thanks. And thanks to our listeners for listening today. And we'll talk to you next week with a clinical topic. Thanks for joining us. We look forward to getting together again next time. The Virtual Curbside is available on iTunes or wherever you find your other favorite podcasts. Be sure to like us and subscribe. We want you to like us both because we're needy that way and because that will help other listeners like you find us. Check out our website, vcurb.com, for supporting materials, schedules, and other great stuff. The Virtual Curbside is an educational production of the Utah chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. The opinions expressed in this podcast, while carefully considered, are ultimately the opinions of the presenters and not necessarily of the American Academy of Pediatrics or our employers. And remember, the content of this podcast shouldn't be seen as a substitute for seeking actual personal medical care. If this is an emergency, hang up and dial 911. Otherwise, schedule a visit with a caring healthcare provider to try to get to the bottom of your concerns. None of this could happen without Elisa Stoddard, our extraordinary executive director of the Utah AAP. Many thanks to Tim Cosgrove for his help on the website and logo design. Thanks to Paul Wirkus, who composed the theme music. See you next time.